Raleigh, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hey, Joe.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. We have Gage. Hi, Justin.
Hey,
Hey, Charlie, how you doing? Oh,
hey everybody.
I had my mute on. I don't know if you can hear me now.
I can
I
hear
can
you
hear
now.
you fine, Dr.
Okay. All I said was, hi, Joe. How you doing?
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
We all made it to the shindig. Technology hasn't failed us yet, so fingers crossed.
Shindig.
I was going to say, for the people watching on Facebook, if y'all have any questions, I'll be monitoring the live stream chat. So if y'all have any questions, just ask them there.
For those waiting, we still have a few more minutes before we begin, but we'll be beginning very shortly.
If anybody's wondering, I'm drinking seltzer water, so it's not 5 o'clock here. So we're
I wonder. Is anyone going to speak? I hope so.
Yeah, we will. I think we're just waiting
We
to.
will, we're waiting. There's still quite a few people coming, logging on in. We'll be starting in just a minute.
See a level of excitement that we've got going on in the group.
Yes.
Yeah, it typically happens every time Gage and I wear hats. Just a normal thing.
It's the hats. That's what
The
did it.
hats.
If you have logged in, you're with the Hurley Heritage Society and logged in to listen to and watch the presentation on the DeWitts and the archaeology done at the Old Dutch Church. We'll be starting in just 1 minute. Okay. Okay, I think we'll start. Justin and Gage, Joe, you ready?
We are ready.
Ready?
I'm ready.
All right. All right, we'll get started. Let me let this other person in. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hurley Heritage Society's lecture series. My name is Raleigh Green, and the Hurley Heritage Society Board's Vice President and the coordinator of this evening's lecture. We have a great presentation for you tonight. For those who are wondering, yes, this evening's presentation will be recorded and posted to the Hurley Heritage Society's website within the coming week for you to review or share with friends. First, however, we would request that everyone remain muted throughout the presentation so that there are no distractions during the presentation itself. During the presentation and the question and answer period that will follow, you can send questions using the chat feature that, if you are unfamiliar, is located near the bottom of the screen. It's identified as chat. Just click on it and you can send a question in during the presentation. This will help everyone to enjoy this evening's presentation, and thank you in advance for your cooperation. A little background on the Hurley Heritage Society for those who are new to the audience. Our organization maintains and operates the Hurley Museum. We're open and free to the public, and our goal and mission is to protect and preserve materials, documents, and artifacts pertaining to the Hurley area and raise awareness of the special heritage of the town of Hurley through events, including tonight's public lecture. We also offer seasonal walking tours of Old Hurley and organize Hurley Heritage Day. We're an all-volunteer organization, and our main source of funding is through the donations and memberships and events that we hold throughout the year. We invite everyone tonight to become a member. Just visit our website. Currently, the Hurley Heritage Society is running an auction, an online auction with dozens of great items to bid and win, including artwork, collectibles, gift certificates, a ticket for 4 to Legoland, antiques, furniture, and much more. The auction is going on now until Sunday, October 30th. You can locate the online auction by visiting our website at hurleyheritagesociety.org. Also, we have on display, if you haven't already seen it, at our museum's front lawn, are this year's wonderful and creative scarecrows as part of our annual Scarecrow Invasion event. Please do check it out when you have a chance. It's again, it's in the Old Village. They will be up until November 1st. In conjunction with the Hurley Library, the Hurley Heritage Society is hosting Cider and Stories this Saturday from 1 to 2 p.m. at the library. There will be a story time about apples. Then we'll continue the apples festivities on the museum's back lawn with crafts, cider donuts, and hot apple cider. It's free to attend and great to share with your children. Now, on to tonight's lecture. The DeWitt family locally has deep roots going back to the 17th century here in the New World. Numerous local roads and buildings have the DeWitt name and association. Many, including myself, can trace their roots to the DeWitt family, who were early colonists in our area. Tonight, we're going to get a chance to learn more about this intriguing family, its history, and the recent archaeological work done by the Kingston Old Dutch done at the Kingston Old Dutch Church this summer. Tonight's presentation is from Justin DeWitt, who's joining us from Kentucky, and Gage DeWitt, who's joining us from Louisiana, as well as by Professor Dr. Joseph Diamond, Professor of Archaeology at SUNY New Paltz, who headed up the dig at the Old Dutch Church. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Justin DeWitt.
Thank you so much, Riley. I appreciate it. I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's tuning in that has interest in this. This project that we undertook was something that we spent over 4 years collecting information, doing deep grounded research on, digging through mountains of archives and Old Dutch literature, Old Dutch documents of our family to come to the point where we are today. So it's been a long journey. We still have a lot more journey ahead of us. You'll hear a lot about what is going on beyond this point in this presentation today as well. So thank you all for tuning in and joining. I want to hand it over to Gage and Dr. Diamond to do their introductions as well.
All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Gage DeWitt. I'm one of the historians with the DeWitt Family Historical Society. And we just want to thank everybody for being here with us as we discuss the findings so far dealing with our exhumation project. And it's been an incredible journey to be able to do a project like this. There's been a lot of great people involved in this project, and there's a lot of people to thank. It wouldn't have been possible without SUNY New Paltz, without the Old Dutch Church, Dr. Charles Gehring for translating a lot of these records for us. There's just a ton of people involved in this that made this happen. And this is just the beginning. The dig is done, but the research continues. So this is going to be a long process, but we have a lot of information available for you tonight.
And hi, folks. My name is Joe Diamond. I teach archaeology at SUNY New Paltz, and I was introduced to Gage and Justin a couple years ago, and we teamed up for this excavation. I'm hoping you enjoy this. We have really great data, and we think as Gage and I have talked about, we think we got our man. In fact, we got 2 of them. So I'll let Justin start.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to do a screen share here as we get a little bit of a presentation. As great as our faces are to look at for the next hour, I know a little bit more context is probably warranted. So just 1 second here. Let me pop this up. All right, my new Zoom feature. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, great. So we're here to start off talking just a little bit about the project. I'm going to do a kickoff and then we'll kind of pilot it around as we go. Dr. Diamond is definitely the knowledge bearer of a lot of the things that you're going to see when we start getting into the contextual aspects of the dig. But as we start to talk through this, Gage and I will give a little bit of a background to the DeWitt family, some of the information that kind of leads into the clues and how we got to where we are today, which led us to doing the exhumation of the actual project. So I'll start off here, then I'll kick it off to Gage and we'll kind of alternate through. What we're looking at here is a photograph as it exists today of one of the earliest headstones that was in the burial plot at the Old Dutch Church. Locally, it was known as the ADW stone, but to us, this is the oldest headstone that we have of our family. This headstone marked the final resting place of Andreas DeWitt. Andreas DeWitt was the eldest son of Cherrick Clausen DeWitt and Barbara DeWitt. Cherrick and Barbara were the progenitors of the DeWitt family in the New World. Cherrick came over here, we believe around 1648 to 1650. We have records of him on ships at that time. We don't know if he actually had settled at that point in time in the region, but he was definitely making trips over here from the Netherlands at that point in time. We do know factually that by 1654, he had made a settlement in the town of Beverwijk, which is now known as Albany. And in 1656, him and Barbara married in the Manhattans. Their record is actually recorded in the Troboic down there. So that's how we know that happened. An interesting bit about that, though, is that that's around the same time that Andreas was born. So there's some speculation to the fact that maybe Cherrick had impregnated Barbara. They weren't married, so they made the dash down the Hudson River to the Manhattans because Cherrick's brother John DeWitt was actually located there at the time. He had a dwelling, and Barbara's family, the Andreassens, she had an uncle that was living down there. So they had family members that could have validated their marriage without the consent of her parents at the time. Cherrick would have been mid-20s. Barbara would have been around 15 at the time that this happened. So we don't know for a fact if she was pregnant at the time they got married or not, but we definitely know that they returned in the springtime and then they had a son named Andres. And this is his headstone. As you can see, it's rudely carved. This right here was not done by a particularly, artisan of renowned carving. We took quite a bit of liberty to kind of look through this stone and understand a little bit more about it. One of the things that we found was, and Gage will talk probably more about this here in a second, is that we've been able to actually identify the person who did the carvings on this stone. And it was actually Andreas's eldest son, who's also named Cherrick. And I'll let Gage talk a little bit more about the naming conventions because it's an interesting concept of how the Dutch name their family members. But the grandson, Cherrick, was the one that actually carved the headstone that we're seeing here today. And it states crudely his initials, ADW, and the date of his passing, which is the 22nd day of July. And I know we can't see it in the photograph. I think we have one that shows the whole one, but it shows the 22nd day of July, 1710. Now, this stone right here is the catalyst to every single thing that we've done from this point moving forward. When both Gage and I made our journey to Kingston to learn about our family's history, we came based on information of the burial plot at the Old Dutch Church. When we arrived, this stone was not in the churchyard. This stone has not been in the churchyard for over 40 years. It has remained today in the museum in the actual church, locked away. It had fallen over at some point in time between the 1970s to the early 80s, and the church decided to put it away safely because this was at the time the oldest known headstone that was still intact at the church. Now, that was valuable for us because it allowed us to do some forensic analysis and investigation on this later, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the one aspect of this is that when we started to learn about this headstone was that the headstone actually had a lot of historical legend tied to it in the area. This headstone was actually tied to a cedar post that was in the ground, and this stone was not covial to the other stones in the cemetery. If we walk around most areas and most churches, you're going to see that the headstones all face in a very specific direction. They're all turned and they're facing towards the east. This stone, however, was turned facing towards the north, and it's been known as the perpendicular stone, which brought a lot of controversy to this headstone over the decades and centuries even that it was there. There's a lot of stories around it, a lot of stories regarding, who was buried there, why their stone was turned sideways. And a lot of those questions obviously led us down the path to kind of find and uncover a little bit more of about this stone. Now, and when we first started this project out, all that we knew was that this stone definitely existed because we could see it, and that according to the legend, it was attached to a cedar post. We didn't have any confirmation of the existence of a cedar post. We didn't know if the cedar post, at what point in time the cedar post may have deteriorated or rotted away, what exactly happened to the cedar post. But as we go through this lecture, we'll take some time to discuss this, because as you see, we're going to try to uncover this a little bit along the way that we did it as we were learning, and provide a little bit of history behind the processes so you guys can kind of follow along with a level of involvement and uncovering the information as we went through it. Gage?
Hey, Justin, we have a few requests on the Facebook chat. Can you minimize that window to the right side of your screen?
Oh, I didn't know you guys could see my face. Sorry.
No, that's all right. They just they haven't been able to read the text on this.
My bad, everybody. I thought that was hidden. All right, let me also try to minimize this as well. Can you guys see my control at the top here? Is it hiding everything?
I don't see anything at the top.
I don't see anything.
All right, good. All right, Gage, we should be good now.
All right. So on the left side here, we have a photograph of the ADW stone and the cedar post actually in the churchyard. We believe the photo was taken sometime in the 1850s because of the area around it. We know the stone house you see in the background is no longer there. It's actually a bank building, Ulster Savings Bank. And we know roughly when that bank building was built. So it kind of gives us an idea of how old this photograph is. This was, and I think we should back up a little bit, because the reason why we set out on this journey to do this project was when you go to the DeWitt plot at the Old Dutch Church, our oldest headstone in our family plot is from 1806. There's roughly 10 to 12 headstones there. Most of them you can't read anymore. But the oldest one was from 1806. And we knew our family had been in Wiltwyck, which would become Kingston, since 1661. So we wanted to know where, and a lot of people in the family would like to know where Cherrick and Barbara are buried. Not just Cherrick and Barbara, but all the other family members. I mean, we have 4 generations of DeWitts missing from burial records and, no headstones. And the reason why that is, the Dutch custom was typically to not use headstones at the time. We do have evidence to believe that they would use a wooden marker, and it would mark more than one burial. They would usually bury people in relation to one marker in the Dutch custom at the time. And we're really fortunate to have this 1710 headstone of Andres. It's the only headstone that we know of that ever existed in our family plot until 1806. So on the left side, we actually have a photograph here that was taken by, we believe, George Gospin DeWitt. And it actually shows a wooden post behind the ADW stone. And the wooden post is really interesting because we thought from the beginning originally that it was a separate marker. The old stories written about the cedar post always attributed it to being kind of a support for this stone. We never really bought into that because it doesn't make sense that you would have a wooden post that large to support a stone like that. And it also doesn't explain why the stone is perpendicular to all the rest of them. As you can see in the photograph, all the other stones are east and west. This stone is facing north and south. On the right side, you have what the DeWitt plot looks like as of 2021 before we dug it. And what this is showing, you'll see a perpendicular stone there, but it's just a blank marble marker. Whenever they remove this 1710 stone, they just put a little marker in its place to kind of mark the spot. And Justin?
Yeah, and a little level of attribute to that we found during the discovery of this and the analysis. The perpendicular stone that you see on the right is actually the base of another headstone. You'll see if you look to the left, two small half moon stones that are much smaller. They almost look like footstones. Those are actually the tops of two other stones. And we've got photographic evidence. It's not in this slide, but that's why I'm kind of discussing it now. That shows who those headstones were actually belonging to. And they're nowhere near the locations of where they were initially placed at. But one thing of interest is that they are, if you look at an angular position of the churchyard, they were at an angular position towards where the headstone that you see on the left, the ADW stone, was placed. We believe, and again, this is conjectural belief. We don't have, we haven't confirmed this, but we did some analysis and some research on different types of weather patterns in the area at different periods of time, and in conjunction to photographic evidence that we had of the cemetery in what we'll call the original state, the state in which the headstones, at least on the Wall Street side, were in their original positions, to the point to where they live now, where some of the headstones have then been moved and adjusted or replaced. What we found was around the 1960s, early 1960s in Kingston, there was a very severe ice storm that was on record. It caused a lot of damage. A lot of trees came down during the storm. One of the things that we found was in the photographic evidence from the 1920s, there in the front of the church along the Wall Street side, there were some very large trees that were there. In photographs that we found in the late 70s, early 80s, one of those large trees was no longer there. And if that tree had actually come down in that storm, it could have very well fallen in the exact angle where we see today in this area, these two stones and the perpendicular stone, possibly causing the destruction. That would answer a lot of questions to what happened to the cedar post, because given the fact that this post would have been just a large piece of wood at that point in time and being snapped off due to a storm, that would have thus been possibly tossed away by accident, thinking it was nothing more than just material there that needed to be cleaned up. That would also explain why these stones were cleaved. And then later on, one of the bases of the stone was concreted in to replace where the perpendicular stone lied. And then the two heads of those headstones were then buried into concrete on the other side of this, not necessarily marking any existing graves at that point in place. Okay, so based on the evidence that we collected when we found this, and again, I know Gage mentioned the background behind this photograph. This photograph is very interesting because up to the point when we found this photograph, the best we could find was some very, very far away photographs of the actual side of Wall Street. And you could vaguely make out a slight indentional bump around the ADW stone. There was no clear representation of exactly what it was. It looked like it might have been a post, but there was no concrete evidence until this picture actually arrived, and it clearly shows a post, and it's a beam structured post. For those who are, somewhat knowledgeable about the post and beam structures of some of the older barns and bridges, there is a very clear indication of a V-notch on the top of this post. So given the fact that crosses in decorative structures like that were not common in Dutch practice, that was more of an English custom. It is very much believed that this post right here was actually used as a structural beam at a building at some point in time, and this repurposed as the center plot for the actual burial area. Now, why that's important to us and why we're talking so much about this post is because based on the information that we've received on this, we believe that this post predates the actual placement of the ADW stone. If that's the case, this right here would have made it a central marker for the DeWitt plot. Why was that important? It was important because based on early Dutch customs, the early Dutch were known to bury their family within a plot, and instead of placing stones or markers for every single burial, they would normally place a wooden marker in the center of the plot, and then they would just bury people around the plot. So as more people passed away, the plot would just expand further and further out from that central post. That was a common practice in the Netherlands, and we had believed at this point in time that that practice could have possibly been brought over with our family and the progenitor of our family, and they would have followed those similar burial customs at that point in time in which he passed away. Gage?
All right. Now, the reason why we chose this location to dig, we had a pretty limited area that we could dig. SUNY New Paltz did this, they funded this dig, provided the archaeology, and they gave us a limited area to dig. I mean, obviously we can't dig up the whole plot. So they gave us a 3 meter by 3 meter square initially. And the reason why Justin and I picked where we did was because of this. We have a family Bible that was discovered in the family a few years ago. And actually Dr. Charles Gehring translated a lot of the notes that were written in Dutch in the Bible. And a lot of these notes were birth records, marriage records, but most importantly, death records and burial records. And it proved to be a very valuable information to help this project along. You can go to the next slide, Justin. All right, let's see.
Okay.
Go ahead and go to the next one.
Oh, okay.
All right. So on the first page of burial records that Dr. Gehring translated for us, we found the death and burial records of Cherrick Clausen DeWitt, his daughter Tatja DeWitt Madison, Andries DeWitt, and his wife Barbara DeWitt. All right, Justin, you want to read the next one?
Yeah. I'll provide a little bit of context to who these people are because, I think it's important that we kind of follow through the suit. Two things from the records that you see here of interest. One is in the photo on the right is the actual photograph of the real records in the Bible that was written in Dutch. The burial records themselves follow chronological order of the dates of death. The top one being Cherrick Clausen DeWitt, who died in 1700. The next one below that is identified as Tatja DeWitt Matheson, who died in 1707. Then Andries DeWitt, which is the most bold one that you see, that passed away in 1710. And then Barbara DeWitt, who passed away in 1714. She's the more faint one at the bottom. Some things of interest about this record that we've evaluated. One is that in the actual translation, which we'll read through here in a moment, the translation for Tatja actually identifies her as my sister. Now, given the fact that this Bible was in the hands of Andries DeWitt, and we know this based on records, wills and deed records of the family willing this Bible down through multiple generations. So we know the point of origin, and we know who was the earliest DeWitt to have owned this Bible, and that being Andries and his wife Jonatja. That the most likely person to have written the death record of 1707 in the Bible would have been Andries himself. So the letters that you're seeing on the right side over here, where it says in 20 September 1707, that right there, that box is actually the handwriting of Andries DeWitt himself. Very cool find on that one. Deeper analysis in the handwriting, in the way of certain words as they were written down and curved and angled. We found as well that the upper writing for Cherrick's burial record and then the writing for Tatja's does not follow the same patterns. You can kind of see this as you look. This individual here was writing, at a right angle, more forcefully and quickly, whereas this one right here has much more pronounced wrapped G's. They have much more rounded off zeros, the way that they write D's for their dittos. This process here is much different than the writing style here. The writing style here, though, does match this writing below, which leads us to believe that the first record of Cherrick and the second record of Andreas was most likely written by his wife, Jonica. Given the fact that at this point in time, we do know that the Bible was still in the hands upon the immediate passing of Andreas. It states as such, Captain Andreas DeWitt instead of my father or my brother. So the belief is that those two records were actually written by the hands of his wife, Jonica. The one further below that, being Barbara, who passed in 1714, we believe that was written by Andreas's son, Cherrick. And the reason why we believe that is that after his passing, when we went through the deed research, because Andreas, when the way he passed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, he was not in a position where he was able to prepare a will for himself. So his eldest son was the one who was the executor of the estate, who actually drafted the will for his family. And in the will, it was bequeathed this Bible to him. So he took the Bible over, and he would have been the one that would have been most likely to have written the next series of records within this. So it's a pretty cool aspect just to point out that within the records, not only do we have information here of who was buried, but we also have indications of who actually wrote the burial records within the Bible itself. Okay, so I'll read the first record and then I'll hand it off to Gage for the next one. So the official translation of the upper one states as such: on the 17th of February, 1700, about 10 o'clock in the morning, Cherrick Closs DeWitt departed this life on the 20th ditto and was buried at the church of Kingston. One important statement to make on this death translation: this vexed us more than anything in our investigation. And then Gage, I think, will back me on this. We had so much deliberation about this because in all the further ones that you're going to see, they're identified as being buried in the churchyard of Kingston. This one right here, where it says, instead of saying Kerkhof, which is Dutch for churchyard, it says Kerk, which is just church. So the way that this was written kind of put us into a thought process of, was Cherrick actually buried with his family, or was he buried in the church? And the original position of the church is not the position where the church resides today. It was actually in the front corner of the cemetery. If you go up Wall Street, and at the intersection at the end of Wall Street at the church property, that square there in the yard was where the actual original church foundation resided. The church that we see today was built in the 1850s and then expanded upon. So thinking the concept, okay, if he was buried in the church, could he be buried in that corner of the lot, or maybe even under the sidewalk? And this was a point of conjecture that we had for quite a long time until we actually came across some additional information a little bit further down the road.
That's right. And the next official translation we had done by Dr. Charles Garing is the death record of Tatya. And it says, on the 20th of September, 1707, at about noon on Saturday, my sister Tatya Madison departed this life and was buried on the 22nd day in the churchyard of Kingston. All right. And the next one, this is where it gets really interesting, because this is a very unique record, and we're very lucky to have this, is the death record of Andres DeWitt with the ADW stone. It says, on the 22nd day of July, 1710, before noon at about 10 o'clock, Captain Andres DeWitt in a sad way was thrown down and severely injured by the breaking of two beams on his bridge, and after uttering a few words, departed this life. And on the 23rd ditto, Sunday, was buried in the churchyard of Kingston. Now, this is the fellow that the ADW stone marks. And again, we're really fortunate to have this. I mean, I don't know of a lot of other examples of a very descriptive death like this, being basically he was crushed to death by bridge collapsing, which is really unique and really helps us identifying, if he was one of the people we exhumed, we should see some indication of that on his bones.
That's right. So the point that we kind of caught out of this was, one, we know that he died in 1710. That would have placed his age of death around the age of 54, give or take a year. And we also knew that, the way that he died was a tragic way. So as I mentioned before, that, he didn't have a will and testament. It was because he didn't die of sickness. He actually died of an accident that severely injured him. And the statements that was here, as you can see, as Gage had mentioned, was that he was severely injured or badly bruised, as it was defined. And then he was only able to utter a few words and then passed away. And then they quickly buried him. So given that into consideration as we go through this, we'll provide a little bit more context as we go, but it was those key things that helped us say, okay, we've got something tangible here. If we do an exhumation, we know that there should be a male roughly in his mid-50s that should have some level of injuries to his skeletal structure that would be representative of a severe injury that's actually occurred to him. And as Gage mentioned, we have no other record of individuals having died in a similar manner. And quite to the contrary, the other individuals that we had believed were buried in that area actually had wills drafted. And that's a typical indication that these individuals died of a more sickly death. So they had more time to prepare and to actually sign off and execute their own wills rather than this situation here. And if you take this into consideration that Andreas's estate was actually executed by his son rather than by himself, that's a clear indication that most of the other ones we could expect to have been more of a sickly death rather than a tragic death with massive types of wounds to the body. Okay, and I'll just wrap this one out here. So the last one that we had here, as it's translated, it says on the 6th day of July, 1714, Barbara DeWitt parted this life and was buried in the churchyard of Kingston. So what we've got here of interest, as we mentioned, we have these 4 records written at the very front of the Bible. It's the earliest burial records in the Bible. And all 4 of these individuals state one thing very clearly, that they're all buried in Kingston. 3 of the 4 state clearly that they're buried in the churchyard of Kingston. So the record information that we got from this Bible and why it's so valuable is that A, we know that the chronological order in which these individuals passed. B, we understand that they're all buried somewhere within the churchyard as it exists today. And C, we know that Andreas passed away of a tragic injury. And then based on the facts that we actually had the photographic evidence of where the headstone was, it puts the placement of his body in a certain area. And knowing that there's a cedar post there that we know from historical research, it should identify the centralized placement of the actual family burial plot. We could conclude that these 4 individuals, being the earliest burials of the Bible, also being 4 of some of the earliest burials of the DeWitt family that had actually developed here in Kingston, that should be the final resting place of all, if not the majority of these individuals.
Mhm.
Gage?
All right. So though no exact burial location is given for any individual listed on this page, there's later burial records in the Bible that leads us to believe that they were all buried within the vicinity of Andreas DeWitt, the ADW stone. And again, his stone was the only stone in this family plot, as far as we know, until 1806. So Andreas DeWitt is the common denominator here for this project. There was never really a question of where Andreas DeWitt was buried. Once we found the picture of the cedar post and the ADW stone, there was never any question as to where he was buried. The biggest question was, where is Cherrick? Where is Barbara? Are they nearby? If we could prove that there were earlier burials before Andres, naturally you would think that they would be, if they're within a decade of Andres DeWitt, like Cherrick was, and in Barbara's case, 4 years after Andres, they should all be immediately near each other. I don't think, nobody would really think that they would be spread out too far. So that was the theory that we had. The cedar post, this red cedar post, was kind of marking the entire burial plot. And that's what we went with. And once we found out exactly where the ADW stone stood in the churchyard, then it was on. I mean, then it was easy to pick the location to dig.
Okay, so what we see here is a visual mapping that Gage put together back in November of 2020 when we were working to seek approval for this project. what we did in preparation for this was we went through the process of just mapping out the entire churchyard based on the headstones that we knew existed, and then based on the images that we were able to triangulate where the headstone and the cedar post actually resided at. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 half moonstones that we saw in the cemetery, they were not marking any known burial that we could find. There was no photographic identification to state that there was any individuals buried in those locations, and it was more of a placement for those stones based on what had occurred to them that damaged them. Instead of putting them away or tossing them, the church had made the decision at the time to encase them in concrete and then place them covial to the headstones that were directly behind them, which was the stones that you see here. Now, the stones that we see laid out here around this, all the gray areas here it's identified, those are the known individuals that we actually have in that cemetery, that we've got headstones that are still either legible, or the old stones were still there, and even though they weren't legible, we had earlier photographic evidence to be able to read those headstones and know who was actually there. Gage, would you like to add any content to that?
No, you pretty much touched on everything. The only thing I would say is that it's really important to notice the gap between Nelcha DeWitt Elmendorf on the left side and Rachel Dubois DeWitt. Rachel is the mother of Nelcha DeWitt Elmendorf. And if you notice, you'll see the ADW stone and cedar post on this map. They sat perpendicular to all these other stones. That gap between Rachel Dubois DeWitt and Nelcha DeWitt Elmendorf has always intrigued us, and for very good reason, and you'll find out in just a little bit.
Gage, did you want to talk about this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were waiting on me. No, you can go ahead on that one. I'm sorry.
Right. I'm too fast. All right.
There's a little bit of a delay on my end here.
It's okay. So what we're looking at here is a drone aerial view of the cemetery before we dug it. The areas here, and I'll just kind of use my marker so everybody can see it. Where the flag is located at, this large stone to the right of it is actually the replaced headstone of Colonel Andreas DeWitt. This right here was the grandson of ADW, Andreas DeWitt, the first Andreas to be buried there. Beside it is a broken down, cleaved off stone. This stone had been deteriorating probably for the last 15, 20 years based on photographic evidence that we had. And it wasn't legible anymore, but we have photographs of the time when that was legible. So that's how we knew that that was Rachel's headstone. And as Gage mentioned, notice the gap here. There's a very clear, recognizable gap spacing between Rachel's headstone and Nelcha's headstone over here. And then knowing that these two markers here were not marking any graves based on photographic evidence that we had, and we knew that this headstone here was actually the top of the headstone that's now resting at the perpendicular position. We felt that this area right here, for us to be able to validate our claims of multiple burials within this area, that we needed to push for a 3 by 3 meter square within the area. Now, if you look here, it's kind of vague, but you can see like these pink ribbons here, located here, here, and then there's some just off site over here and over here from the photograph. That was the actual marking positions for the burial exhumation. So we targeted this area specifically based on two things. One, we know that this right here is pretty close, within a matter of 6 inches in either direction of where the original ADW stone stood, and more importantly, the cedar post. The second thing is that we know who should be buried here, because we have Major Thomas's headstone, and we have who is this one again?
Major Elsie Hasbrook.
Elsie Hasbrook. It was Major Thomas's wife. So we have Elsie Hasbrook here. So knowing that they should be buried here behind their headstones, there really wasn't a need for us to want to dig this area, because again, we know who those individuals were. But this right here was what we dubbed the unknown plot for the DeWitt family, because we believe that there should be multiple people buried within this area, but there's no headstones to indicate that. And if our theory proves true, the cedar post that was centralized here would have been marking multiple burials that should have been covial to the cedar post itself.
Mm-hmm.
Gage, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, the initial exhumation area was 3 meters by 3 meters square. That's what Professor Diamond and Professor Nystrom said we could dig. Of course, if it was up to Justin and I, we would have just went crazy with it. But we had to. There had to be a limit here, so we picked this area. That was our best educated guess as to where we would find who we were looking for. So that's the initial area. But later on in the project, we did have to end up expanding the hole 2 different directions to I think 6 feet to the the east, and another 2 or 3 feet to the west to get everybody out. So, but that was the initial area there.
Yeah. And the reason why we did this, we didn't expect that we were going to be that good at positioning a square at the top of the ground. The reason behind this positioning is that we figured we would probably end up intersecting graves along the way. Our focus was really more on the fact of, can we identify and triangulate the positions of these burials covial to the cedar post? Because again, based on our research and based on our theory, was that the oldest burials in the DeWitt family would have been covial to the cedar post. Given the records that we had from the Bible, that would have been those 4 initial individuals that we had in the Bible. Those would have been, or should have been, buried around the cedar post within the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
This right here is just a visual representation, to kind of show the mapping of it. Here you can kind of see that we have the markers out here. So this isn't really fully indicative of it. It was a little bit bigger than our square, but this is where we dug, this positioning right here.
Yeah, and it's important to note too, remember the 2 half-moon stones you see on the bottom of your screen aren't marking known burials. And it's important to remember that, because we don't want people thinking we were just digging up a bunch of marked burials. Those 2 stones do not belong in that area. So whenever you take those 2 stones out of the equation, you have this big open area in the DeWitt plot. So that's just keep that in mind.
Absolutely. So given the fact that we're kind of starting off here and we're showing the start of the exhumation project, Dr. Diamond, would you like to chime in and kind of give a little bit of a discussion
Sure.
as to what we're seeing?
So on the lower left, that's one of the first photos we took after we had cleaned off the 3-meter square, and you can see the fact that all of those stones are just set in concrete. They're all something that is relatively recent. In the upper left and the upper right, there are 2 photos of I believe it was Paige finding the iron strap that held the post to the ADW stone. That's one of the things that you didn't mention, the fact that in the literature there was a strap around both of them holding them together, as well as the fact that there were also iron spikes. So on the upper left, you can see Justin kind of cleaning around the iron strap while all of the hairs were standing up on Gage's neck, from what I remember.
Yep.
Because I had predicted this during the previous year, that we were going to find the iron strap based on some having a metal detector give a really strong signal right there. In the lower right, you can actually see students kind of working their way down. You can see that there's an ash layer right behind Susan and over by Kevin. That's an ash layer that appears to be from the late 19th, very early 20th century. Probably people were throwing their coal and wood ash into the cemetery during the winter, I would think.
Absolutely. And something that we'll get to as well, Joe hasn't mentioned it, but before we actually conducted the dig, we actually came out and we did GPR scanning on the ground. And we came up with quite a bunch of parabolas and disturbances all within this area, didn't we, Joe?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
Yeah, which later on it proved to be pretty much null and void.
Yeah, because there's a lot going on here in terms of soil movement and also buildup. As you kind of work through the slides, I'll show the level of where the churchyard used to be and how much buildup has actually occurred since that photograph was taken in the 1850s. Okay. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So this is looking down. There's kind of a this is on a pedestal. On the right is what I'm pretty sure is the base of the the ADW stone. That's when it broke off. It was taken upstairs into the church to protect it. To the left of that a little bit, there's a large dark stain, which is the location where the post was. To the top there in the upper right is a piece of limestone from when they were constructing the church in 1852. So we're right down on that layer where the church is being the church that's there now was being constructed in 1852.
And that's important to note, because as Joe mentioned, the disturbances that we saw during the GPR scan, as it turned out, there was a lot of overburden that was added in here during the construction of the church that was filling in the churchyard. You can imagine a lot of lulls where there would have been potential burials, and the ground settling. And over that time, they were using that to kind of just toss a lot of this disturbances in there. So when we got down to that layer, we were like, okay, something's not matching up here. We started finding a lot of this rubble, and at that point we kind of looked at each other and I was like, should we follow the GPRs anymore? And he's like, no. No more value there.
Okay, yeah, so this is just kind of an act, I hate to call it an action photo, but you've got the electrical line serving this the sign out in the yard, the churchyard, which luckily we didn't break or cut up. On the right is the base of the ADW stone. And interestingly enough, there's a dark stain that you can see coming from the lower left, coming up, yeah, right in there, and it basically hooks around and goes underneath the ADW stone and that little pedestal that's left on. That is probably the grave of, or at least the grave shaft for Rachel Dubois.
Absolutely.
DeWitt Dubois, Rachel Dubois DeWitt or whatever. I forgot
Yeah,
to write
Rachel
her name
Dubois
down.
DeWitt. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So this is the pedestal and profile. So what you're looking at here is a section of soil that we left up so that we could kind of take it apart slowly. And what you can see on the right side of it, down on the bottom, that dark kind of like reddish brown, that is what appears to be the base of the cedar post. And when you kind of look up, you can actually see where the post was in the soil, and it had been taken out and the top of it filled in with a darker soil. So right to the very top of that, on the right of that pedestal, would be where the ADW stone was. And we have a pretty good sized sample of the cedar post. Can't do much with it in terms of C14 dating, but it will be sent out to a paleoethnobotanist for analysis.
And something else to point out of interest in here was this, because it's kind of not really considered. It wasn't considered by us until we got in here, just exactly how big of a piece of wood this was. In the photographs that we saw of the cedar post out of the ground, if you take it into comparison to the ADW stone, that post would have been roughly 4 to 4.5 feet above soil in that photograph. Where we're at right now, Joe, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think right now we're close to, in a trajectory of feet, probably around 4.5 feet below the top layer, which would have made the post, what you're seeing right there, already being almost 8 feet in length.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the post actually continued down even further into the ground than where it is right there. So it was a very large piece of material that they used to set in this position for it. Something else that I just want to bring up here real fast, and I'll change it, is if you look on the pedestal, this is also a pretty good view of this. You're going to see more of it later. But if you look at this area right here, which I believe was roughly about 1.5 feet deep at the bottom of it, this right here is where we were getting into all of that conglomerate, all of that overburden of buildup material that was basically tossed away from the actual construction of the church. And it was a layer that was probably around 15 to 18 inches in depth in certain areas. So it was quite a bit of overburden that was in there.
Yeah, so these are the on the left, you see the iron strap that we found pretty high up that students were excavating before. On the right, there are two large, they kind of look like pintles, but they're not. They're just large hand wrought, I guess you call them like angles that were used to hold the post to the stone. And we found them directly in the area of the post and the stone. So it's not like we found any of these anywhere else. We just found them right there inside that that pedestal that we made to keep the post intact so we could photograph it.
Yeah,
Justin, before you go any further, before we get to pictures of remains, I just want to ask that nobody screenshot or distribute any of these photographs of the remains. We're going to publish our own photographs on the DeWitt Family Historical Society's Facebook page and website. So I just ask that people not distribute these until we publish those on our site.
Yep, thanks. So, hold on one second. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so one of the things to point out here, we don't really know the specific date and time in which these were attached or affixed to the headstone. We do know factually, as you could see, there was no banding that was visible in the late 1840s, 1850s photographs. So it is unknown if this was something that would have been more of an original to that stone when it was initially placed, or if that was added later as either the stone may have suffered some level of damage and it was being used to be held up by the post, or if the post itself had began to wither away and they were using this to hold the cedar post to the stone. That right there, just in case anybody has any questions about that, we don't have any type of evidence to actually showcase that at this point in time. But we were able to validate. Go ahead, Joe.
Justin, both of those spikes on the right are hand wrought, so they're probably I would say at least 18th century, if not earlier.
Yep, so that's what I was going to get to the point. I was asking. I'm sure that there's some probably dating that we could give it though. Good deal. Okay, so real fast on this. This is what we've dubbed the hobgoblin key. Gage and I have been, as you can see on our backdrops, just a quick plug, we're actually going to be, for anybody interested in it, Saturday night at 8 o'clock Central, or 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. We're actually going to be doing a pilot episode showcase, not of the DeWitt Family Project, but of something else that happened to us that was a little bit of more of an ethereal event. And this key actually had a little bit of the story and lore to it. I'll tell a little bit about the key, and then Joe can actually tell you the reality of the key. But there was some lore associated to the perpendicular stone at the family plot, and according to the lore that was given, and there's several different stories about it, by the way, and Gage can probably tell a little bit more of them, but the one that was kind of taken into consideration, which is leading to that show, was that there was a hobgoblin that attacked the dominie of the church back in the mid 1800s that led them to basically push the hobgoblin, or exercise the hobgoblin, however you want to say it, away into the steeple of the church. Then they prayed over a relic and they buried it by the perpendicular stone. And there was tells of it being a skeleton key. So there was a little bit of humor in the fact that, during the dig, we actually found a key within that area. Gage, did you want to add any additional color to that?
Yeah, I mean, I told Joe we wouldn't talk much about the hobgoblin, so we'll keep it brief. But I think we're pretty certain that we let that hobgoblin out of his room up there. So y'all have to watch that episode Saturday to find out if we did or not.
Right, absolutely. So with that being said, we'll provide more of a scientific and contextual aspect to this. So Joe, if you'd like to give a walkthrough on it.
It's just a key. I don't know if it relates to the hobgoblin or not, but it could be. It might just be a skeleton key. So, I mean, it might actually relate to the legend or the folk myth that you're talking about. It's really difficult to tell.
Absolutely, yeah. So for anybody who may ask questions about that later on, if you want scientific information, that's the scientific information. It's just the key.
The key.
All right, Joe, go ahead.
Okay, these are photographs of students doing wall profiles. So on the upper left, you have Navneet and the head of Rachel, who's basically doing some measurements. Susan in the upper left and Kevin are pointing things out on the south wall. Naomi Hertz, who is now at SUNY Binghamton, starting her master's thesis, is doing the wall profile. Lower left, you have the same thing. Rachel is taking measurements, and I believe Naomi is still doing the profile. What you can see in that in both of those photos, actually in even the central one also, you can see the water line for the the old Dutch church going right through our excavation, which we had to be very, very careful about not breaking, because it would have cost a lot of money to fix, and also it would have been really a drag to try to get a new water line through the graveyard. The other two photos on the right are also people doing profiles. The central one is Susan and Kevin. Susan on the left of that picture is basically taking the measurements that Rachel's giving her and putting them on the graph paper, and Sean with his Syracuse shirt is just sitting there kind of soaking it all up.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, whenever we found that water line, kind of had a sick feeling in my stomach, because we thought the burials were gonna be a lot shallower than what they were because of the GPR scans. And when we found that, I kind of thought that maybe they tore up a lot of burials when they dug the trench for this water line. So luckily it didn't interfere with any of our burials, but we kind of thought it might have when we first found it. At least
Yeah,
I
so if you go to that lower right picture where Rachel's on the left and Navneet's on the right, you see that that white layer of coal ash. Above that is really recent stuff. The coal ash is probably from about 1902, 1904, because we have an Indian head penny. There's kind of a yellow soil below that. That's mostly the soil that is probably after the 1850s. And then you see that darker soil in there. That's basically fill from a number of grave shafts. So both Rachel on the left and Navneet on the right are standing in some grave shafts at that point.
Mhm. Yeah, so a couple of things there to add to that. If you look at the left here, you can actually see, and this was very important for us in relation to what Gage was talking about, because when we were on site, we were worried about how disturbed the ground was when they put this pipe in. But when you look over here, by the coal line, you can see here where you start seeing like the coal disturbance, like it's just kind of multi-layered through there. On the site, you could actually see this much more clearly, but there's a clear V indication here. So we could tell by the disturbances along the ground and how the material fell, that essentially what they did when they dug this out, they just channeled in a V. So the point where the pipe was essentially the bottom of the dig. And it went from a positioning of around 15 to 18 inches in width at the top level here, which as Joe had mentioned, this is pretty recent soil, down to a positioning of around maybe 5 to 6 inches wide, which is where they laid the pipe. So it did give us a little bit of a side of relief on two things. One, to what Joe said, when we got to this layering here, we knew that we're now getting into the areas where the soil disturbance level is pretty much almost original to the period, and we're into the shafting here. And secondly, the pipe itself, it stopped right here. So there was no level of being dug further, and it wasn't disturbed beyond that point. So as we got into this period of kind of overburden that was already there after the burials, we realized that there wasn't a whole lot of disturbances below that. So when we were working in pristine soil, we were actually working at the period where we felt pretty confident when we got to this level that what we were going to find would have definitely been still intact. But to also navigate, and as we'll see through this, we had a ways to go. We were still a little ways out at this point, and surprised nonetheless as to what we ended up having to do to actually exhume the bodies. Joe?
Okay, so on the left, you have Sean, Susan, and Paige just kind of working their way down, kind of peeling it back. And of course, there is that, you can see on the left under the blue tarp, there's the water line. As we worked our way down in the southern portion of the unit, we actually had to use we couldn't stand on the water lines. We had to keep climbing over it with buckets of soil to get everything out of there. And you can see that in the photograph on the right. What do we have? Kevin's in the middle there. Naomi has started to take down soil. At this particular point, we've removed that post where sorry, that pedestal with the post and where the ADW stone was, and basically got a ladder to get out of there. Gage is walking around, and the thing to keep in mind is right where Kevin is standing. We actually took back, Gage and Perry DeWitt took back a 2 meter by 2 meter square to enlarge the excavation area. Where the water bottle is in the foreground on the right, we opened up a 1 by 1.5 meter square to come further to the west to take out some burials that were starting to basically show up a little bit as we kind of worked our way down.
Mhm.
And these are some of the soil profiles. And again, you can see each one is labeled. You have the south wall in the upper left, the north wall in the lower left. All of these are showing grave shafts, or they basically are in grave shafts. The center one is showing in the lower right-hand corner. We found stones that were laying flat right in the this would have been what is it, Rachel Dubois DeWitt's marker, but way down. So this would have been on either side of the ADW stone.
Right. And this point right here was when we started getting really excited, because the theories that we had of multiple people being buried around the central cedar post, we started to actually see some validity to this, because as you can see, this is all positioned. We're still within that 3 by 3 meters square. We haven't started to spread beyond it in these photos. So what we're identifying here is that there are multiple shafts around in conjunction to the cedar post. So at this point was the first level of realization that Gage and I and the team had, that the theory was being proved to be accurate, that there was more than one person buried there, and that there are potentially multiple burials within this area of unknown DeWitt burials.
Hey, Joe, we got a question.
Yeah, somebody had a question about what is a grave shaft. A grave shaft is essentially just the grave that is excavated to put the coffin into. So you'll notice that in the center portion, I'm sorry, the center picture on the left side, you'll actually see that dark stain. That's a series of overlapping grave shafts.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
On the left, you have Gage and Perry DeWitt, who are basically taking out a 2 meter square. There was one day, it was on a Monday, when we were in the lab and students weren't there. So basically I laid out the 2 meter square for these guys, and they literally blew it down to where we were, or where we wanted to be, without finding any human remains. And then basically, when I came back later in the afternoon, they had cleaned everything up, and that saved us an enormous amount of time. You can see that they did hit the electrical line a couple times, because there is some fresh black tape on there. On the right side, Paige and Sean are working down in the foreground. In the background, you have Kevin and Susan, who are using a shop vac to take out the soil in a burial. And one of the things I want to call your attention to in the photo on the right is, look how sandy that soil is. It is, and I think this is probably one of the reasons why some of the bones were kind of fragmentary when we got them out. It's very, very soft. When you stand on it, it collapses very easy.
Absolutely. And I'm not in these photos because I had to come back to Kentucky. It wasn't because I was avoiding the work. I just had to come back and work myself
Oh,
on some
no,
other stuff.
nobody thought that. This went a lot longer than what we thought. I mean, we thought within, middle of week 2, we would hit remains, and it was the end of week 3 when we hit remains. So,
Yeah.
there was a lot of hurry up digging after that. Perry and I had to blow that hole out to get down to the burial. So
Yeah.
And I
we
think,
were,
I
go ahead.
think part of the problem was the amount of overburden. We had almost 2.5 to 3 feet of overburden from 1852 up. So I wasn't planning on that.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, all of us had been surprised because the depth that we ended up having to go, at least based on what Gage and I had assessed, because we had believed that there were stacked burials, there were more than one burial spacing there, that we were about 3 times deeper than what we had initially thought we were going to expect. And I don't know, Joe may have been more prepared for a deeper dig, but for us, we really did believe that around 2 feet underground, we would start to see the discoloration and the shafting, and we would be on top of the bodies by then. So from a timeline perspective,
GPR scans, we were seeing parabolas at like 2 feet, 3 feet
Yes.
deep. And what we were picking up on the GPR scans was just a layer of stone.
yeah,
Yeah.
It wasn't bodies at all.
yeah. So our this say that was an interesting thing, because as we went through this, and I was up there with Gage for a month, and Gage, you were there for like 6 weeks total. There's 2 more weeks where we had to continue to go on this project.
Yeah.
The first couple of weeks, if anybody's ever had the situation where you just you get a Band-Aid on hair and you have to pull it real slow instead of just taking it off all at once, that's kind of what it felt like to us emotionally, because it was like, we're going through this process and we're doing a scientific dig, but we're not seeing things that are really showing it. We get a little bit of hope, and then it would be dashed because we would find, well, that's not old enough. It's not old enough. And then we get to this period. It's like, how deep do we have to go? And by the time that I left, and I will put it out there that we did find the first remains before I stepped away. So at least I knew before I walked out and had to come back to Kentucky that we were where we were supposed to be finally, and it wasn't just a hole to some abyss. That was nothing but just electric lines and water pipes. So
Well, it was an emotional roller coaster too, at least for Justin and I. The scientists, they don't really get emotional, but Justin and I have been working on this for so long. We wanted to be validated. And there was one Friday, I think it was the end of week 2, maybe right before Justin had to leave. Joe and I had to go to the dump to dump some stuff. And Justin calls me on the way. We're on our way back to the dig site, and Justin calls me and is like, "Dude, we found a skeleton. We got a bone, man." And we all start getting. It was on a Friday, and Joe was like, "Oh, it always happens on a Friday." And man, I was so excited. And we get back to the church, and Joe takes one look. He gets down in the hole with his brush, and it's a bone. It's a big old bone. It looks like a jaw. And Joe says, "Well, either your ancestor was really deformed, or this is a horse jaw." And that's what it ended up being, was a piece of a horse jaw about that big. So we thought it was one of our ancestors, and that was what, 3.5, 4 feet deep. So we weren't even close at that point.
No, we weren't.
And
that,
the whole time.
yeah, and that's that up and down piece that we're talking about, because as we dug through this, we kept finding all this debris. People would walk by the church, eating a piece of turkey and throw their turkey leg in there. So we'd find the bone and we'd be like, this is a bone fragment. We've got to we got to be getting close. And there was one point, Joe, I think it was probably around week 3, wasn't, when we came into a whole debris field of all of these clustered bones. And it was the first time when we thought, all right, we finally got here. We were maybe 4 feet at the time. But what we found out was it was just a cluster of this refuge that somebody had tossed in there from their dinners. There was all kinds of mixed bones, and it turned out not to be human.
It was bones, oyster shells, and clams.
Yeah. So you can imagine, Gage and I, how we were feeling. It's like we would find this little glimpse of evidence and we would get super excited, and then we would fall back down. We get super excited and we'd fall back down. So it was just getting to the point, like, are we ever going to find these individuals? And are we are we digging in the right spot, or are we just basically doing, free utility inspections for the city?
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to talk really fast on some of this stuff, and then we'll go back to Joe talking on some of the other visual details. As Joe mentioned, we started with this 3 by 3 meter area, and then we had to expand. The reason of expansion was because, thank goodness, we actually found the remains that we were hoping that we would find. And as we had initially discussed, those remains, we were never expecting those remains to be perfectly placed in the 3 by 3 meter square. We knew there probably would need to be some level of expansion once we got down to the layer and we identified the bodies, that we would probably have to move a little bit around to be able to get the bodies exhumed. So this visualization here just kind of shows the positioning of where we were. Now, obviously, we knew Nelcha was there. We knew Rachel was there. They were exhumed, but the purpose behind that was a couple of points. One, they were further in to the 3 by 3 shaft than what was initially anticipated, and we did not want to just do a partial cleaving of any remains. The second reason was because of their positioning being a little bit further into the 3 by 3 meters square than what we initially thought they were going to be. There was also potential that there could have been burials underneath them. So the only way to verify that was to actually exhume Rachel and Nelcha and then dig further down into the area. So that was why there's a decision that was made to basically do a 2 by 3 meter expansion and then remove further down below those areas, just to make sure that we did in fact thoroughly search around the cedar post. Again, we're looking for the oldest burials. So we just wanted to make sure that we weren't leaving the oldest burials behind, because if we would have went and just removed the top layer burials and didn't go any further, then we wouldn't have captured the older burials if they had been stacked.
Yeah, at one point we talked about the fact that this was kind of like a one-shot deal. I would have a hard time getting my students to come back the following year, dig down about 6 feet, find a piece of plastic and start, from that particular point. We actually talked about it being a one-shot deal. We had to get these folks out of there and kind of complete the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say this, the team at SUNY New Paltz, they stood up to the challenge. And as Gage mentioned, it may not have been as emotional to them as it was to us, but there was definitely a level of emotion and definitely a level of almost ownership to this project. Like every single individual there on that team wanted to see this project through. There was not a single person that was lackadaisical to it or felt like, I'm just here to do this and I can't wait to go home and just call it a day. When they showed up to work. They were there with us. We were showing up, doing everything we could, screening material in the holes, as you can see in the photos. It was a team effort. And the only reason, and I will say this just so everybody knows, the only reason that we found success was because everybody involved saw this as a team effort and everybody stood up every day and put their foot forward and made this happen.
Right. And there was a lot of dedication from the students, and there was also a lot of other people that came by to help. And two individuals in particular, I think we do need to mention is Jamie and Perry. They spent a lot of their time, with us, and they would come just about every day to the site, especially once we had to expand the hole. They came and helped dig. Jamie was moving buckets, she was digging. Perry was moving buckets and digging too. So we just definitely have to thank them. And Jim showed up too.
And Gage, we can also throw in John Quick for helping with the backfilling.
That's right. Yeah,
Yes.
John.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
John Quick, Taylor Brook, he came and helped.
People came in right off the street and helped people and help my students backfill.
That's right.
And there was a lot of material to backfill. So
Yeah.
that was welcome. Okay, so this is a visual representation. Before we get to the actual remains, and Joe will talk about that, I wanted to kind of set up like a visualization chart to what we saw. So everything that you've seen shows the digs, and you know how the expansion worked. This right here is the visual representation that we've kind of been following through. So we have Nelcha's headstone here. We have Rachel's headstone here. We have where we believe the ADW stone was at in the cedar post, which turned out to be true. We were off, I think, by 3 inches, but it was right there where we expected it to be. Now, when we made our first discovery, the first discovery was located here. This was a burial. This was, as you see from pink, female burial. We'll give that one away. But the first burial that we identified was located here, roughly about 2 feet down from where the cedar post had actually stood at. We found their feet first, and we were able to confirm, obviously, that individual was facing east, which was an aspect that we were trying to figure out as well, because one of the things of question was how were they placed around the post. There's conjecture on the old evidence of how they were buried in the Netherlands. One statement that we'd found from an older book discussing burial customs was that they buried people in a star pattern. So that was one of the thoughts that we had, was there was a potential for star burials. And if that was the case, then there would have been many, many more burials there. There would have been many more exhumed people, and we would have been probably backlogged in examining people for probably 10 years. So thank goodness that that was not the case. They did follow the standard custom that everybody was buried facing the east so they could rise to the east. And all the burials that you'll see in this was buried in that same positioning. But the first burial we found was here. We found by the time that I had to leave at the end of the month, which was at the period where we thought we would have had everybody exhumed. We actually had uncovered a leg up through the femur, and then the probably 2/3 of the pelvis, far enough to where Dr. Ken Nystrom was able to come in and do a visualization and say, most likely this is a female burial right here. From there, we continued on. And the next burial that we actually exhumed was Nelcha. We found her first. We did the exhumation with her. We then continued across on the other side of the cedar post, and then we found we removed Rachel. And again, we removed those two because we wanted to have a clearing there. If there was older burials underneath them, we would be able to capture those. From there, we turned back to the burial positioning here. As the team was removing the first burial, they found another burial stacked atop that burial. And again, during the cleaning, they found that to be also a female. But then as they continued to clean through that, they found a third burial stacked on top of that one. They weren't directly positioned. You'll see in the images that they weren't stacked like we would think perfectly on top of one another, but that would be expected given the fact that they were trying to position these bodies covial to a single headstone, which would have been the cedar post. So if they would have placed them within the cedar post and these burials were about 2 feet off, they would have essentially just dug down till they got to a body, until they actually hit a grave, and then they would have laid the next body in there. Then they'd have done the same thing and laid the next body in there. So they didn't have an actual marker spot to say, this is the headstone, this is where the top of the body is. Let's start here and work down, then they'll be perfectly lined. The bodies were slightly dispositioned from one another. Then from there, we went over to the other side and they started to remove. And this is when it got to the point of even more excitement, because again, directly across on the other side, that empty space that Gage had mentioned, they came across yet another burial. This burial, as they started to remove the body and clear it, they found that this one right here was likely to be male. So at this point, we feel like, okay, they're not burying men and women on top of one another. And based on the information that we received on how they stacked burials based on their customs, they would not have done that. So this was proving to be correct. After burial 6 was removed, they continued to dig down, and below that burial, we found another burial number 7, which was another male. Now, Gage, you can talk a little bit more about how much further you dug and what was found or uncovered below that. But I know that there was more that was done beyond this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we just, that was the extension that Perry, Jamie, and I had to work on. And I don't know, after they removed burial 7, we did, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but I think we dug down another couple feet below, or maybe 1.5 to 2 feet below burial 7, just to make sure there was no other burials underneath that one. So we dug down to what do you call it, Joe? Glacially deposited gravel.
It's a glacially deposited sand. So Gage and Perry did a trench on a north-south axis, right about where you see, let's say the shoulders of burial 6 and like the midpoint of 7 in there. They dug a trench all the way across that unit. They went down quite deep, and they were in glacially sorted sands, and that's from the late Pleistocene. So basically we knew we weren't going any deeper right there. And I was very happy when they did that, because that was a really hot day. It was the weekend, and I knew that basically we had kind of gotten our man.
Yeah. So the only thing left was dinosaurs.
Yeah.
We left the dinosaurs. We didn't remove them. Okay, Joe.
So this is, okay, I'm trying to orient myself. Okay, so I'm not sure what burial this is.
This
so
is
you have,
Nelcha.
oh, this is Nelcha. Okay.
Well,
so
Nelcha's on the left, Rachel's on the right. So,
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think it is Nelcha. Yeah, it is. So you have uh, Sean, Paige, and Susan excavating Nelcha. And the other thing in terms of technique, you'll also see that the students are using a shop vac. Had a number of shop vacs donated to us, which really speeds things up in terms of getting soil out. You'll also, again, notice how sandy the soils are down here. We're getting really deep. We're in glacially sorted sands. All of Kingston, in this particular portion of Kingston, is a glacial outwash terrace. So it's really, really kind of coarse sand that moves really easily. On the right, we have, I believe that is,
That's going to be Rachel right there on the
yeah, that's
right.
Rachel. Yeah, that's Rachel.
Yep.
So what I'm looking, my photograph here has west to the top of the photograph. And of course we had that root cutting across, and so they are just kind of cleaning off Rachel, and they're kind of working their way down. They haven't even gotten the shop back out yet because they're just outlining the coffin somewhat. Yes, the question came up, were they buried in caskets? They were buried in caskets. We do have some nails. One of them appears to be a gable-lidded coffin because we found a couple nails going right down the middle of the body, so that would have had a gable lid on it, kind of like that. But we didn't find any shroud pins, and except for Nelch's, we didn't really find any ornamentation. Nelch's had some gilded handles on the coffin.
Any other questions, Gage, that you see on Facebook?
Nothing on Facebook. Nope.
Okay. And then we'll move on. Okay, Gage, would you like to talk through?
Oh, yeah. I'll talk through. Yeah, so burial number 2 was Nelcha DeWitt Elmendorf. She was the wife of Petrus Elmendorf, and he actually has a nice tall stone just outside of the DeWitt plot, probably about 2 burial slots over from her. She had a marked burial. Her headstone was not legible. It hasn't been legible for probably 100 years. We have an old photograph of it. That's who we know who it is. We can kind of relate it to the church and see who it was. And she's currently the only verified DeWitt ancestor to be exhumed. As we know who she is. She's a genetic DeWitt, a descendant of Cherrick and Barber, and I believe she would be the great-great-granddaughter of Cherrick and Barber DeWitt. The burial number 3 is Rachel Dubois DeWitt. She died in circa 1823. She had a headstone. The headstone was also in rough shape. It stood about this high, and it's been dilapidated for 100 years. Burial number 1. Now, this is where we're going to speculate, given the contextual evidence of what we expected to find. And a lot of this is kind of lining up to be true. Justin and I think burial number 1 is Tatya, is the oldest daughter of Cherrick and Barbara. As of right now, the early analysis says that she is a female, right? So we found the 3 women on the west side of the cedar post, with their feet about 2 feet from the cedar post. They were equally spaced from the post as the men's heads were on the east side. So we know through the chronological order of the Bible records, we know that the first burial in our family plot near that cedar post should be Tatya. She died 7 years after Cherrick, after her father. So we kind of we were looking for that to be Tatya, and everything right now, just kind of the preliminary analysis says that it might be. It's likely to be. And the burial number 4, which was on top of burial number 1, was the middle burial in that stack. We speculate that it might be Barbara because, again, appears to be a female, and just the placement, given the contextual evidence, it should be Barbara. But again, we just want to take that with a grain of salt because no analysis has been done on her remains yet. Just a brief analysis in the hole when they were removing the bones. So we think that it's likely to be Barbara. And burial number 5 is a burial that we did not exhume. They were stacked on top of each other, but they were a little bit off-centered of each other. And burial number 5, which should be Jonica DeWitt, the wife of Andres, her body went into the western wall of the hole. and it was too far. It was underneath the big mound of dirt, our backfill. So we didn't have enough time to expand the hole to remove her. So, and we didn't want to just take her bottom section of her body. We didn't want to do that. So we just left her body there. But burial number 5 is who we think would be Jonathan.
Yeah, and one extra thing to mention on that, on the ADW stone in the older photographs, and we were able to do a little bit of an analysis on the stone itself. Her initials are actually carved on the top right of that stone. The same individual, it's the same type of hand carving, so the same type of hand writing on the stone. So we do know that her name is marked on the stone in the day of her death. So given that additional information, that's why we believe that to be Jonathan, because of the placement of the bodies based on the dates of death that we have on record, as well as the fact that she, I guess we should also take into consideration, she's also one of the people that was marked on the headstone. So we know that her and Andreas should be buried next to one another based on that. Mm-hmm. All right, Joe.
Okay, yeah, so this is Nelcha DeWitt Elmendorf. Oh yeah, this is the one that they were working on before. Yeah, so this is burial 2, the with her head to the west, feet to the east, and again you can see the sandiness of the soils. I mean, one of the things you're going to be seeing coming up is the fact that burial number 6 has a very fragmented skull. We're not really sure if that's from something that might have happened when the bridge collapsed, and if it is Andres DeWitt, or basically just when you're walking around on these soils, if you're compacting them, some of the people that were in there had some pretty big feet, and what that does is it pushes down on the on the soils, and that might be the cause for burial 6's crushed cranium. Okay, this is Rachel on the southern side, and you can see that the burials are in pretty good shape. Oh yeah, and for the most part, if you look at the top of the picture, you can actually see the outline of the coffin. It was hexagonal, so it kind of was a little bit broader just above the pelvis, and then it kind of angled in towards the head. We did get some nails here indicating the construction type also, but again, everything, you can see that the soil is kind of falling apart in the background, and the foreground kind of looks like a beach, so it was really difficult to keep things in place. This is burial 3. We had this is just the beginning of burial 3. So oh, I'm sorry, no, this is burial 3.
1, 4, and 5.
4, and 5.
Oh yeah, burials 1, 4, and 5. Okay, yeah. So down in the lower left, you have burial 1. In the middle, you have the pelvis for burial 4, and then on the right, you have burial 5, which we did not take out. And this is that 1.5 by 1 meter square that allowed us to go in far enough to get these particular burials out. I believe Sean, in the last day or two, followed burial 4 up and went above the shoulder blades and went all the way up and got the cranium out. So we have burials 1 and 4 out.
Yeah, and to what we just discussed before, and from positioning, from our current beliefs based on our information, and it's a grain of salt, what you're looking at here, this we would believe at the bottom would be Tatcha, and then this individual here we believe would possibly be Barbara, which would be the female progenitor of our family, and then the leg that you see in the pelvis on the upper right, we would have believed to that have been Jancha, based on the burials, and because we know Tatcha passed away in 1707, and in 1715 we know that Barbara passed away, and then in 1733 Jancha passed away.
Yeah, so this is actually after we're taking the previous the burials above, for example, number 4 taking out to get down to burial number 1. The reason that this is number 1 and it's at the bottom is because we found the feet and the lower limb bones first, so we called it burial 1. What we didn't realize is that number 4 and number 5 were going to be stacked on top of burial number 1. This is just another action photo of Susan flagging the, she's putting some pins into the soil up in there because we were starting to actually square off that 1.5 meter square there. And we wanted to kind of flag things so that we could put down some plastic and then basically kind of work our way back. And you can also see on the right there that one of the burials has been taken out and the bones are being wrapped up into aluminum foil.
Okay, so before we go into the next ones, the males, the burials 6 and 7, were the ones that were most focused on our side from the perspective of analysis and DNA. Because as we mentioned earlier, we know Andreas had severe injuries. We also have, out of everybody, the most records on Cherrick. Cherrick is actually in the records in Kingston over 300 times. So there's a lot of information we have on him based on potentials for his attitudes, things that happened to him, injuries he may have suffered in his life. There's just a lot of information we have. So when we found the 2 males stacked on top of one another, one of the things of interest that we had was that there was a documented publication by William Walsh that I'd mentioned earlier in the early 1900s that claimed that Andres was buried in the same grave as that of his father. And given the fact that we had a headstone for him, and this was directly in relation to the cedar post and to the ADW stone to the east side of it, we found these 2 male bodies stacked on top of one another. So the first fact that we looked at was, could this possibly be Andreas and the bottom male be Cherrick? For us, that would be a home run because we would have, as Joe said, we would have found our man. But there's other people that could have been buried in there at the time as well. We know that there was a Henry DeWitt that would have passed, the 3rd generation Cherrick. We know he's there because we have a burial record stating he's buried there. And if you look at the positioning, Colonel Andreas to the right, that is the son of the grandson Cherrick, the 3rd generation Cherrick. So Colonel Andreas is actually a 4th generation DeWitt. And then his father would have been Andreas's son. So it would have also meant a little bit of value to say, all right, well, maybe that would be 3rd generation Cherrick there because his son's buried to the right of him and his granddaughter would be buried to the left of him. Mm-hmm. So we knew that was possible speculation to that point as well. But some of the things we also have to take into consideration is their age. We know that when 3rd generation Cherrick died, he was between the ages of 79 to 80. So he was a much older man when he passed away. Henry, when he passed away, he would have been in his mid to late 60s when he passed away. So we were looking for a person with an age range in their 50s. Andreas is the only male DeWitt who passed away in this period of time that passed away in his 50s. There was 2 other people who passed away, 2 brothers of Andres that passed away before him and Cherrick, or before him and before Cherrick, and that was his brother Klaus, who was actually technically the first DeWitt to pass away. And we know that because the records that we have from Cherrick's will, he was sick in the late 1680s, in 1689, 1690, and he drafted a will. And at that time, his son Klaus was listed in the will. And based on his christening records, he would have been, 17, 18 years old at the time. But by the time that Cherrick got sick again, and he did pass away subsequently in 1699, Klaus was no longer recorded in the will. Additionally, from around 1694, 1695, we have no records of Klaus in any of the record books anywhere that we found, not just in Kingston, but we've looked in other areas. We've not yet found any records on him. So we believe that Klaus passed away at a very early age. He would have been somewhere between the ages of 17 to maybe 22 when he passed. The other individual that passes is Gage's, great grandfather, Lucas DeWitt. He passed away between the period of Cherrick and Andreas. And when he passed away, he was sick. He had a slow death, and he drafted a will. And we know at the point in time when he died, he was engaged, I believe he's what, 27, 29 years old?
Yeah, somewhere in between 27 and 30 years old.
Yeah, so both of those men would have been very young men when they passed. So we know that if they would have been found, we'd be looking for someone in that range era. So what we found was that the upper burial, and Joe had mentioned about the crushed cranials, and that's still under investigation to see if it was something that was done by stepping on the sand, or maybe it was something that was an injury that was sustained during that individual's lifetime, or it could be a combination of both. There could have been fissure cracks that could have deteriorated, and we could have stepped on it and crushed it as well. But the things that we do know based on fact and evidence is that this individual was determined to be male, and I believe that's been confirmed at this point to be male. This individual has been examined. I think the first one has actually gone through a more of a almost complete examination. We're still doing it, but they've been examined. We've got information today from Dr. Nystrom that the age determination came through. This individual is aged between 50 to 55 years of age, which would put him directly at the age of Andreas DeWitt. And again, there's no other DeWitt that was buried at that time that meets that age range. So again, it's focusing back on being Andreas. The other thing that we look at is the placement in relation to burial 7. This being an earlier burial, it helps us kind of make more speculation to the lower burial below that individual. In addition to that, we know that he was in direct relation to the ADW stone. Even though the ADW stone was facing towards the north and south, he was buried directly in line with this stone facing to the east. So given the fact of the placement of the burial, it would have made sense that one of these two men would have been Andreas. The additional thing that we mentioned is the cause of damage to the cranial region. And again, we haven't been able to validate if that damage was done post-mortem or if it was done during the period of time in which he was alive, and that could have been the cause of his death. But definitively, this is the only skeletal body that we have. It's got severe cranial damage to it. So again, linking it to his death record of a beam falling on him and crushing him, there is damage, and then linking to the fact of the age and the placement against the ADW stone, we believe that this burial is Andreas DeWitt. The reason why that's exciting for us is that, as I just mentioned, with the other potential burials there that would have happened by a male DeWitt before Andreas's passing, the only 3 that would have been there would be in his brother Klaus, his brother Lucas, or his father Cherik. And given the fact of the information that we know on Cherik to this point, we believe that there's a great likelihood that burial 7 is Cherik, Klaus, and DeWitt, the progenitor of her family. This is based on a couple of key factors. One, as of right now, we believe that is a male. The proportional size of the remains is of interest because a lot of the records talk about how afraid people were of him in the village. There's a lot of records of people being very concerned about Cherik, not really wanting to fight with Cherik. And then the times that he did get into a fight, it was either to a brutal end for one of the individuals, or people shunned away and then immediately called in assistance. So it was either the fact that he was just a very ill-tempered person that people feared, or the fact that he was a very proportionally large man of large girth that would have just put a lot of fear in the individuals at the time. The other point that we know is again, the placement to the burial 6. Given the fact that we have an age range now for burial 6, and it falls right in the age range that we would expect Andreas to be, in believing that this is probably an older burial, not just by the burial depth, that's obvious, but by the aging of the bones. And this is a very initial analysis here. We haven't confirmed it, but the fact that this body does seem to be older than the body number 6, we do believe this to be Cherik. And then again, the accounts by William Walsh state that Andreas and Cherik were buried not within the same graveyard, but within the same grave shaft itself. Leads a lot of credence to believe that we've got an identification of burial 6 and 7 at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Justin, we have a couple questions.
Yes.
The first was what is the length of the rod we're using for reference? That's a 1 meter rod that's broken up into 10 centimeter white and black portions. Every 10 centimeters is about 4 inches, so that'll give you an idea. Significance of how the arms were placed, they're normally either down the side of the body or they're crossing over the pelvis. For Andres, the question from Kimberly was, is there any other damage other than cranial? Both burial 6 and burial 7 are kind of lacking some of the elements because they're not, the bones are not in all that good a shape. Some of them are in very good shape. Burial 6's skull is in not particularly great shape at all. It's going to be difficult to kind of get it back together again, but burial 7's is in very, very good shape.
Sorry, guys. My battery was getting low. Had to go get the charger. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Joe?
Okay, so this, oh yeah, so here, this is a burial 6. This is probably who we think is Andres DeWitt. And the reason for this is that the depth of the burial, again, we can't really at this particular point determine if the fractures of the skull were from the cause of his death. It might turn out to be that case. We're not quite sure yet. I might also add that he's lying stratigraphically over burial 7. In terms of what Justin was talking about, one of them being buried in the same grave shaft as the other, this is really good evidence that we have our 2 guys here.
Yeah. Something else to point out of interest is that Ken had noted, and if you look at the spine on this, I know it's a little difficult because he's still in the ground, but and Joe, I believe some of his vertebrae are actually fused together.
They're fused. Ken seems to think it might be ankylosing spondylitis.
Right.
Basically, he's got a situation where his about 6 or 7 of his vertebrae are fused together.
Yeah, and why that's interesting is that we know based on the will records of what was deeded out that he had a walking stick or a cane that his son Cherrick took. So we do believe, based on some of the information that we have on Andreas, that in his adult life, or at least later in his adult life, he was plagued with some injuries that limited his mobility. And this is our man.
Yeah, this is burial 7. This is, we think, most likely the burial of Cherrick Clayson DeWitt. His feet kind of extended into the wall of Unit 2 a ways, so my students had to go in to retrieve those. And you'll note he's pretty robust. As Gage said, he was kind of probably a tough guy in the little village of Wiltwyck in the 17th century. But basically, his skeletal elements held up pretty well. I might also add that for the dental evidence for both Cherrick and for Andres, they both smoke pipes, and when you look at their dentition, you can actually tell which side of the mouth they smoked the pipe on, because between the incisors and the canines, there's a gap where they sat their pipe.
Yeah, we actually have a picture of that we included in the slideshow.
Okay, cool.
For Cherrick.
Yeah, and some points of interest, if you just look at the burial of Cherrick, the positioning of the broadness of his arms and how he was laid.
He was a big guy.
Shows representation to how big he is. And I know taking a photograph, it doesn't really do justice, but after seeing him in person, I'm 6'4", Gage, you're 6'2", 6'3".
Something like that.
We're girthy guys. I go like 290 and I'm pretty broad shouldered. His shoulder structure is broader than my shoulder structure. Representationally, this was a very big man. And if you take into consideration the period that he lived, the average size of a male was not as big as we are. So he would have been a very imposing figure in that period of time in which he lived. And it kind of answers a lot of those questions, because when you hear people, and I'll just, take a very quick moment to tell a funny story about him. After his daughter Tatcha was kidnapped by Native Americans during the Esopus Wars and was taken away, there was a 30-day period where, they had to search for her. They didn't know if they were going to find them. After they found her, there's a lot of records that kind of show he was really disturbed by this, suffering from what we would probably call today PTSD from it. Actually, he was having a lot of emotional problems, and because of that, there was a lot of write-ups about him because of the fear of him being, obviously now we know the girthy person that he is. One specific record was by a neighbor of his, which took it to court, claiming that there was a concern for him being in the village because it was noted that the night before he was heard and seen storming around his house in a threatening manner, as if to kill every man, woman, and child within his home. In questions like that, you think, all right, there's obviously different types of social disturbances that people see, but to be like, all right, well, why was that such a unique thing? Because there's none of the records on other individuals like that. So why were they taking a note to bring it to court for Cherrick? Well, once we've seen the size of this man, it starts to bring a little bit of light to it that they were probably feared, because if this man wanted to do significant damage, he probably could do significant damage. And there's a concern now. It's like, all right, this answers a lot of questions. A lot of people were really concerned because when he spoke up, when he got angry, a lot of people took note to it.
Yeah, he must have been a big old guy. And he had a really large chin too, because what I noticed seeing him in the lab, the space between your bottom of your bottom teeth here and the bottom of your chin. I mean, my gap's like this big. This guy it's much larger. I mean, he had a large chin. He must have been a really large fellow.
Yeah, it looks like our typical gap spacings. I think mine's like maybe 1.5 inches. Gage is about the same. His is well 2 inches, if not above. So it was a very impressive. He would have had a very impressive jawline. And this is a better photograph, I think, of Cherrick's face. One of the things that I was very amazed with, and Joe, you can probably context on it, is exactly how many of their teeth were still intact, and how well their teeth are. Because you would think that at that period of time, people probably would not have had the best hygiene to have maintained teeth like that.
I was very impressed by Cherrick's teeth. I was not impressed by Andre's. I think, and I was telling Gage this a little while ago, I think that Andre's had some serious dental problems. He was missing a lot of his premolars and all of his molars, whereas Cherrick had pretty decent dentition for an older guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and taking into consideration this individual passed away in his 70s, so he lived a very long life.
So there's the left side of the mandible, showing the gap where the smoking pipe would be, and on top of that, the maxilla would have the same kind of gap, probably between the canine and the first premolar, where that would come down on that, so that you could kind of clamp your smoking pipe between your teeth and just kind of hold it there.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question on Facebook from Jennifer Barnes, and it's actually a good question because we were actually looking out for this as well. She says, well, were there any rib injuries to burial 7 male? Well, that's exactly what we were looking for, because we all know, if you know anything about Cherrick, you know that he almost died. He was stabbed by a man named Henry Pauling. And that's actually what we were looking for, was knife marks on any one of his ribs, because the record says that the knife touched upon the rib. Unfortunately, Cherrick's ribs were pretty much all gone. I think there was like a little pile of flakes of his ribs, and that's about it. There was really nothing we could see there. So,
yeah, as you can see here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was looking at his ribs today and talking to Ken Nystrom about trying to figure out if there were any marks from any kind of wounds, and there's really not a lot much there to go on. I think the real strength of looking at this particular individual is to look at the strontium analysis that we can do on the teeth and the bones to determine if he's a local or if he's a non-local. And the strontium should tell us whether or not he's from the vicinity, which will be the case for Andres, but it wouldn't be the case for Barbara and Cherrick. They should have totally different strontium signatures than their children.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that we're really excited about getting information back on, because as Joe mentioned, this will help to narrow down what our suspicions are at this point in time. If the female that we believe is Barbara has a different profile than the others, and this male individual has a different profile than the other male, it helps to close the gap even further. Getting closer and closer to that point, because our goal, Gage and I's goal as part of the DeWitt Family Historical Society is to leave no questions about it. So, I mean, we can look at what we have right now, and Gage, I think you would probably be in agreement with this. If we didn't go any further, then we feel probably 95%, 96% accurate to state who we believe these individuals are. But there's more evidence out there that we can still collect, and we're wanting to gather that evidence to make no doubt about who we have here.
Yeah, that's right. And somebody says there appears to be more teeth on Cherrick than in the previous shot. In the previous shot, you really can't see the bottom teeth very well. This is an up close shot of his, I don't know, what do you call this, Joe?
That's the mandible.
Mandible.
In the previous shot, all you're seeing is the maxilla, and the mandible is still buried in the soil.
Yeah. Yeah, so he has a good set of teeth, it looks like.
Yeah, and here you get a better visualization as to the profile of his lower jaw, his chin. He had a very pronounced chin. That's it.
Yep, and Tom Luntz asked, he says, I'm descendant of Cherrick and Henry Pauling, so one almost killed the other. Yeah, that's correct. Cherrick and Henry Pauling really did not like each other. And it's a long story. It's just some 17th century Jerry Springer type stuff, but there was a lot of stuff going on between Cherrick and a man named Matthew Blanchard, Henry Pauling. There was a Rosencrantz girl involved. So, but long story short, Cherrick, and we actually know this through the court records, they actually quote Cherrick verbatim what he says, and he says, "Halt, man, kill me as you did my pig." And so he's accusing Henry Pauling of killing his pig, and Henry denies it and says that, if you can prove it, prosecute me according to the law. And Cherrick again accused him of shooting his pig, and Henry claimed that I haven't fired a gun in 12 months.
Yep.
Yeah, and Cherrick draws a knife and says, "If you're a man, stand firm." And he challenges Henry to a knife fight, right? And Cherrick tries to stab Henry Pauling, and he actually cuts Henry's trousers where his pants fall down. And then he goes in for another stab, and Henry stabs Cherrick in the ribs.
With a sword.
And we know he was bedridden for at least 2 weeks for it, because they had court about a week and a half later after this event, and the court was actually held in Cherrick's house. They actually had to go to Cherrick's house to interview him about this because he was bedridden. He almost died. And the thing about it is, he and Barbara were already together. They already had Andres and Tatcha and Janacha. But at this point in time, Lucas had not been born yet, which is my guy. So if Cherrick would have died during this, I wouldn't be here right now. So yeah. I'm really glad that he survived that.
And this ties to another story that we have on Cherrick, which is very, very funny. There's if anybody's watched the film that we posted on Facebook, kind of talking about this when we were getting the permission for this project, Taylor Brook was talking about Geisberg in his house over there, and he was being the barber surgeon. And one of the funny stories that we have on record is that Geisberg Van Imbrock actually sued Cherrick because of the money that he owed him for this exact event where he was stabbed, and he came to his aid. He rendered his aid to him, and Cherrick was making an argument saying, "Well, I don't owe you the money because during the Esopus Wars, your house was on fire, and I put your house out. So since I saved your home, I just shouldn't owe you a dime for you saving my life." And the courts did not judge in favor of Cherrick. He ended up having to pay the debt. But yeah, it's funny because, like I said, this is a thing of interest that's so amazing for our family and what Gage and I have been doing is that all of these stories, we can piece all these stories together, and it doesn't just tell a point in time or a very specific moment that had occurred, but we can start joining these stories together, and it starts to tell a little bit more of the life that these individuals actually lived. And when we start to put together what Dr. Diamond and Dr. Nystrom and Dr. Gehring have all worked with us on, as well as the team and all the additional information that we're going to be pulling together on this, it starts to paint a picture of these individuals. We start to find out more about how they lived, what they look like, how they would have interacted and interrelated with one another. And we start piecing all of this together, and we start to really build a story around very early colonialism in America and how the early Dutch practiced and lived and interacted with one another. We can't take that, for a grain of salt or take it without context to it. I mean, we are focusing, on our family's history, but this history is spread beyond just the DeWitt family. This history actually goes through understanding and researching and learning about the history of the early Dutch settlers here in North America. And we hope that a lot of the stuff that we find on this and all the investigative work that we put together and we publish off of this is going to be used to help, teach the history of the early Dutch settlers, especially within the areas of Beverwijk and Wiltwyck.
And one more thing I'll add is now that we're pretty confident, 99% sure that burial 7 is Cherrick, burial 6 is Andres, given the contextual evidence, and pretty much we found what we were supposed to find. The stories that we read of Cherrick in the court records make a lot of sense now after seeing the guy in person, seeing how large and intimidating he must have been. The stories make sense now. I mean, we know he was, I don't even know what word you would use for it in today's terms, because you had to be kind of crazy back then to leave the area of the Netherlands and come to an unsettled area. So there was already that disposition about him. He had to have been a little wild anyway, but this guy, when you read about him in the court records, he was a very interesting person, to say the least. And after seeing his remains in person, it all makes sense. And I will say, and we had a lot of support on this project from the family. We had a handful of family members that weren't really crazy about us exhuming our ancestors, but I think it will make them, and everybody came around. We really didn't have any pushback on it. But what I think would make a lot of people feel better about this is Cherrick specifically, burial number 7, and we actually have the footage of this. We're going to put it into a documentary. Is DeWitt family members actually exhumed Cherrick. So when we were down in the hole, Perry, Jamie, and I were down in the hole with Sean, a student, and we actually exhumed his bones ourselves. And it was really an emotional process. I mean, just looking at the remains of my 8th grade grandfather, I mean, we pretty much knew then at that point that was Cherrick, and it was just a surreal experience being able to do that. I mean, we're talking about a man that was born almost 400 years ago, and to sit there and participate in that process was amazing. And now we're even more sure than we were then that this is Cherrick. So I think that'll make a lot of family members feel better, is that there was family involved in this. For anybody that might be a little uneasy on this, it was a lot of family members involved. Jamie, Perry, Justin, and I, a lot of descendants of Cherrick and Barber participated in this.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here that I want to address. One was, and I'm glad this brought up, Kimberly made a mention of it here. What about the burials of Cherrick's sister Ida and her family? Mm-hmm. As the people who may have studied the DeWitt family may know, during the Esopus Wars, Cherrick lost his sister Ida, her husband John Albertson, and then an 8-year-old daughter of John Albertson's was also killed. And then Ida was with child at the time, and both her and her child perished in the aftermath. At the beginning of this project, there was some speculation that Gage and I had that there could possibly be some burials. They could possibly be buried there. There was also some details on at least the death of the 8-year-old child. So if we were looking for a young child, we would have been looking for potential injuries that she would have suffered. I won't go into the gruesome details of that, but there was injuries that we would have been looking for. We found no indication that Cherrick's sister and John Albertson was buried in the DeWitt family plot. It seems to be that Cherrick would have been the first to have been buried in his family's cemetery, and then his children and the rest of the family around Andreas's side would have been buried around there. So based on the information that we have from the exhumation, and if we validate these findings to its conclusion, we would say that it would be Cherrick and Barbara buried there, and then Tatcha would have been buried there along with her family, because there are Mathesons that are there. There's headstones of Mathesons. And then from there, we would have gone through the process of saying that the rest of the family would have been down the lineage of Andreas. So that's who we believe would be there. Now, there's a couple more. I know I see that one that popped up there too, Gage. Yeah. So the next question that we had below that was in regards to, where are we at here? I think we had one more up here.
Are you reburying them and labeling them with a stone?
Yes. So we've been in contact in regards to this before we even started the project with the church. To kind of walk through what we're going to be doing as we go through this, because there's more processes to be done. As SUNY New Paltz completes the analysis of the bodies, we intend on getting DNA samples of the remains and sending them off for DNA testing. That'll close out any questions as to who those individuals are, because the DNA will, without a doubt, validate the relationships between the family members. And then we can take the DNA information, because it's so far back in time, we can take that all the way back to the medieval period, and we can start to validate the other individuals that Cherrick might be related to in the Netherlands, where he came from. Once that's done, we're also going to do facial reconstruction using 3D printers and digitalization. We can do a digital screen of the skulls, and we can send them down to LSU, and we can actually have digital reconstruction of the faces. We can see what these individuals look like when they lived. All of this is the continuation of the scientific processes that we're doing in order to validate these individuals and to affirm the people that we have. Once this is done, then we do intend on reburying these individuals in the exact placement in which they were exhumed from. And we will be erecting a marker there by the church. This will be something, though, that in regards to what the marker is going to look like, because I know some people have asked questions about that. We've had different conversations around it. It's going to ultimately come down to what the church approval is as to what we'll be able to place there. But the consideration is that what we would like to see is the fact that since the bodies of these individuals were placed around a single memorial, being the post, we would like to do something that would symbolize what the original post would have been, but be something that would last a lot longer than a pole of wood, right? But put a single marker there, and then identify on that marker who is actually at rest, and then have some type of positioning to show which positions those individuals are. So that way we've got a proper memorial set there for them. Second thing that Gage and I have talked about that we would like to do, and this would require the bringings in of the city of Kingston, is because of this archaeological project, we would like to put some type of a signage on the sidewalk by the DeWitt plot that would actually have a little bit of information about the project and provide a little bit of information about Cherrick, and then possibly provide maybe even a QR code to an on-site library where people who have interest and would like to learn more about both the project as well as the history of the family could follow a link or follow something to go back and research and learn more. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Any other thoughts? Gage, you see anything on Facebook?
Let's see here. They're asking how tall we think Cherrick was. I don't know, Joe, have they measured Cherrick?
I don't think that Ken has taken measurements on the femur yet. That's normally the bone you use for stature.
Oh, okay. And somebody asked, is Barney Andres' brother? Barney. I don't know. No, there was no Barney in the family at that time. Barney, maybe. Let's see here. No, I don't really, have you started DNA testing? We've already answered that. I think that's about it on Facebook.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I'll just do a quick wrap up on my end, and I'll let Joe and Gage do their wrap ups, and then we'll hand it back to you, Riley. So, again, everybody that's tuned in, I just personally want to thank you all for having interest in our project and in our family. That's a very great thing to see so many people interested in the work that we've done, because again, our mission in this position of what we've kind of put ourselves in is to be the stewards of the family history. When we're no longer on this plane of existence ourselves and we're buried somewhere in the dirt, we hope that the work that we've done lives on with other people who have interest in this family and wants to continue moving forward with it. In addition to it, one of the things that's honestly kind of vexed me for my lifetime is the limitation of Dutch history in our history books. A lot of people kind of started off at the point in time of the English, coming over and settling and, kind of taking forward from there through the revolution, in which time we broke away from England. But there was a whole period before that. There was a period of indigenous people here, periods of Vikings coming over, then the period of the Dutch settlements. There's a lot more history that we often don't take enough time to really appreciate or consider. And we hope that this right here is a stepping stone that we're providing for other people to step in and to continue this journey of history and finding out more information about North America, about the individuals that actually were even more trailblazers than the ones that we study today, that treasured these areas and the dangers of nature and to find a better path of life for themselves. So I'll just kind of close on the whole project aspect with that and say that, that's kind of the ultimate goal that we have is seeing that process through and continuing on. And just I would be remiss if I didn't do one more short plug that if you guys are interested in engaging myself and our zany characters, be sure to tune in Saturday night at 8:00 for the first pilot episode of Uncovering History. And if we get more support, the more support that we get on it, the more episodes we will be able to publish off of it, and hopefully we'll move very rapidly from social media to production television, and you'll get to see our faces a little bit more commonly than then. So thank you.
That's right. Yeah, and we just want to thank everybody for attending this meeting. We know there's been a lot of people interested in the findings, and we did not intentionally withhold any information from people. We wanted to immediately release photos and information from the dig, but it wouldn't have been very smart to do without the analysis. So we just figured we would hold off a few months, let Joe and Ken do their analysis, at least to where we could be very confident that we were dealing with Cherrick and Andres. And believe me, it's been very difficult to bite my tongue for the last 2.5, 3 months. There's a lot of people that were really chomping at the bits to see pictures, to know information, and we just didn't want to tell anybody, any kind of incorrect information. So just thank y'all for being really patient with us. We wanted to be sure it's who we were actually dealing with. And Joe's going to be really happy about this. We're going to do T-shirts in the very near future with this project. So Joe's been pushing for T-shirts all summer. We just kept putting them on the back burner. So if y'all are interested in T-shirts, we're going to be doing project T-shirts to raise money for the further analysis. We have to pay for DNA research. We have to pay for strontium analysis, to pay for the facial reconstruction. So we're going to be doing T-shirts and accepting donations eventually. We're not currently doing that at the moment, but just follow us on the DeWitt Family Historical Society Facebook page, and we'll be putting that information out there. And again, we just want to thank SUNY New Paltz. I mean, they really kind of went out on a limb for us. Joe and Ken did. It really, when we approached Joe about this dig, I expected everybody along the line of trying to convince everybody to do this. I expected everybody to say no. And surprisingly, nobody said no. And Joe was one of the first people we approached, and I figured Joe would think you guys are crazy for wanting to dig up your ancestors, but he saw that we had a very good reason to do it, and he never he never turned us down. So they kind of went out on a limb for us. They paid for the archaeology. We had a lot of really good local sponsors too. Herzog's Hardware in Kingston donated the shop vacs that the students use to dust the dirt off of the bones. And Hart Water Systems in Kingston also donated. What did they donate, Joe?
The buckets.
The buckets. They donated
Yeah.
buckets. So
Yeah.
it was kind of a community effort. We had local businesses donating things, and we had just too many people to name right now. But we had a lot of people just come by the site, especially once it came time to fill in the hole, which was quite a job. We had people just that came off the streets and grabbed a shovel and helped us shovel dirt back in the hole. So that was it was very nice to see the sense of community we all had during the dig. It was very great. I mean, there's something like this, to my knowledge, hasn't been done in Kingston. So we were a little bit worried about how the community would react. And except for us releasing the hobgoblin on July 13th, the rest of the dig went really well after that. So, it was really nice to see the sense of community. And we'll plug the show. Y'all got to check out the show, because I'm telling you, July 13th, we let that hobgoblin out of that church. He's running around Kingston doing all kind of stuff. Y'all got to check it out.
I got to do one more thank you because I want to shout out to one of our family members, Mark Saunders. He donated a replacement tent for us because the day we broke ground on the cemetery, the first recorded tornado hit uptown Kingston and destroyed our tent. It threw it up in the air, ripped it up, and Gage and I was there. Gage tells the story way better than I do about the tornado. But it wrecked the tent, it wrecked my car. And Mark was kind enough to step up and replace the tent. I had to replace my own car, but it's all good. But no, he did step up and do that. So I definitely want to give a shout out to Mark Saunders, because he stepped up, and he's another one of the family members, just like Perry and Jamie were, that were there, lending assistance, doing what they could to assist to make sure that this project went off without a hitch.
That's right. And when it came to crunch time, when we were running out of time and we had to hurry up and expand the hole and dig down, but a lot of people, and Jamie and Perry, Jim Deckard came down in the hole for a couple of days. We had a lot of people who weren't really affiliated at first that came in. So the project quickly grew from just Justin and I's idea into just dozens of people involved in this. And that's what's so great about this. And I just want to let everybody know that it's not over. I mean, we have all this analysis to do. We're going to be making a documentary about this project. So everybody has that to look forward to. So it's not over. There's ways that if people want to help participate in this, we have a lot that needs to be done. We want to do similar projects, maybe not digging up graves every summer, but just we want to do big things like this for our family history and for New Netherland history. So if people want to participate in this, come on board. I mean, we need all the help we can get to make things like this happen. So.
And just so you're aware, Joe, we've got a treasure hunt on the list for one of the episodes of Uncovering History. So if you're up to do some fly fishing and a little bit of treasure hunting, we'll bring you along for the ride.
The fly fishing is not a problem.
Okay, are you, Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add before we conclude the evening's wonderful presentation? I think.
No, I think those guys told a pretty good story, and they told it the way it happened.
All right. Well, I tell you, that was a fascinating story, and you've got an enormous amount of data that you're going to hopefully come back and share further analysis and insights and stories. That was great. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Hurley Heritage Society for a wonderful presentation. And to those who didn't catch it earlier, we're going to be posting a recording of this on our website within a week. Check back to the website and check our Facebook. On that, I want to thank everyone, Gage, Justin, Joe, and all of you who have attended. Wonderful presentation.
Thanks for having us on. I definitely appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
We'll take you up on that.
All right. Everyone have a good evening. Thank you.
Okay, signing off.
Y'all too.